All right, buckle up for this one. Today we're diving into the murder of Barrett Beck. She was just 18 when she vanished on a work trip back in 1990, leaving a bunch of confusing clues behind in her van. We're going to be breaking down this story using a true crime podcast episode as our source. They really dig into the investigation and the forensic breakthrough that finally happened, and the controversial resolution that had a lot of people asking some tough questions about justice.
Yeah, it's a case that really shows you how far forensic science has come and how sometimes justice takes a really long time.
So, okay, try to picture it. It's July 1990. Barrett just graduated high school, super excited, lands her first real job. She's got this training seminar in Appleton, Wisconsin, about 130 miles from home, sets off in her family's van, ready for this new chapter.
Yeah, I bet a lot of people can relate to that feeling, that kind of excitement of starting your career.
Totally. And at first, everything seems normal. Barrett's parents, Diane and David, are a little nervous, of course, but super supportive. Help her pack, make sure she's got everything, even write down the van's mileage for her work expenses. Typical parent stuff. But then things get bad. Barrett misses her check-in call with her parents that night. And when she doesn't show up at the seminar the next morning, well, that's when the alarm bells really start going off.
Missing that call, that was a big red flag, especially because it was so unlike her.
Absolutely. Her parents knew something was really wrong and called the police right away. A be on the lookout alert went out for the van, and 2 days later, it was found, abandoned in a shopping center parking lot in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. But here's the thing. The van was about 100 miles from her home, 30 miles short of where she was supposed to be.
Those missing miles, those are important. It kind of feels like something happened during that time that changed her plans.
Right. And when they searched the van, it only got weirder. There were signs of a possible robbery. The radar detector and the radio were gone. But some of her personal stuff, like clothes and a ring from her boyfriend, was just left there. What do you make of that?
Well, that kind of conflicting evidence, it can really mess up an investigation. Was it a robbery that went wrong? Or was that staged to make the police think it was something else?
Those are the exact questions they were asking, and there was more that didn't make sense. They found cigarette ash in the van, but Barrett didn't smoke. Her clothes were all messed up. A red t-shirt was ripped. A pink dress was on the floor. There was even a pair of pantyhose with a knot tied in them.
Those details, they're kind of scary. Like maybe there was a struggle or someone tried to tie her up.
I know, it's disturbing. And remember, this was 1990. Forensic technology wasn't what it is now. DNA testing was just starting, so investigators were relying on fingerprints and good old-fashioned detective work.
It really makes you appreciate how far we've come and how much we take for granted these days.
You're telling me. Meanwhile, Barrett's parents were doing everything they could to find her. Huge media campaign, $75,000 reward, search parties. It's heartbreaking to think about how desperate they must have been. Weeks went by, turned into a month, and then the worst possible news came.
Finding her body, that must have been devastating. It ended all hope that she was still alive.
It did. A farmer found her body in a ditch by a pond in Waupun, Wisconsin, about 18 miles from the van. Her body was really decomposed, made it tough to identify her, but the clothes matched what Barrett was last seen wearing. And to make things worse, she was blindfolded. They used a piece of red cloth tied around her head.
That blindfolded, that's really disturbing. Shows a level of planning and control that's really scary.
Dental records confirmed it was Barrett, and the case became a homicide investigation. They couldn't say for sure how she died because of the condition of her body, but the medical examiner thought it was either strangulation or suffocation.
So now they had a murder victim, a potential crime scene in the van, but no clear suspect. This is where gathering and analyzing every little piece of evidence becomes super important.
And it led them in a few different directions. They had fingerprints from the van, but none of them matched anyone in their database at the time. They were also looking into a possible connection to some car thefts happening around then, focusing on a guy named Craig Rann.
Was there something specific about him that made him a suspect?
He was known for stealing cars, driving them long distances and using them to commit other crimes. It seemed like a possible fit, especially with those missing miles between where Barrett was last seen and where they found the van.
So basically they were trying to put together a puzzle with not enough pieces, looking for any connection, any clue to figure out what happened to Barrett.
Exactly.
And then they got what seemed like a big break.
They did. Rann was arrested for robbing a bank, and get this, they found a hairbrush with him that matched the description of one Barrett owned. There were even blonde hairs in it, similar to Barrett's.
That's a pretty big piece of evidence. Did they charge him with Barrett's murder?
No, unfortunately not. Without more solid proof, it wasn't enough to charge him with murder. And get this, someone who knew Rand claimed that he actually confessed to killing Barrett, even showed him her body.
Wow, even secondhand, a confession like that has to be taken seriously.
Mm.
But again, they need more proof to actually convict him.
Exactly. So even with all that pointing to Rand, investigators didn't have the clear proof they needed. And without being charged, the case went cold for over 20 years. Can you imagine how frustrating and painful that must have been for Barrett's family? Knowing the person who might have killed their daughter could be out there free?
It's a terrible thing to carry. It shows how strong they are that they never gave up hope.
They didn't. But the story's not over. New developments in forensic science and the people who refused to let this case be forgotten led to a major turning point. Sometimes it's the smallest detail that can blow a case wide open. And that's what happened in 2013. A local news station decided to do a story on Barrett's case for a series they were doing on unsolved crimes. This got people talking about the case again, and that's what led Detective Nate Lamont, who had actually been a dispatcher when Barrett first disappeared, to take a fresh look at everything.
Well, that must have been quite an experience for him.
Yeah.
Going back to this case after so many years with new tools and a whole new perspective, how did he approach this cold case review?
Well, he started by basically digitizing everything. Handwritten notes, witness statements, every single piece of information to create this huge digital archive. But what he really focused on was the physical evidence, especially those fingerprints they got from Barrett's van back in 1990. And here's where it gets interesting. For some reason, they never ran those fingerprints through the national database, AFIS.
That seems like a pretty big mistake. I mean, those fingerprints were some of the best evidence they had.
It was a huge missed opportunity, but luckily, Detective Lamont saw that and immediately submitted the prints to AFIS. And within weeks, they got a match. 5 of those fingerprints belonged to a guy named Dennis Brandner. And the crazy thing is, Brandner's name had never even come up in the original investigation.
So a brand new suspect appears decades later, all because of technology and one detective who wouldn't give up. So what did they find out about this Dennis Brandner?
Well, what they found was pretty disturbing. Brandner had a long rap sheet going all the way back to the 70s. Car theft, stalking, breaking into a woman's hotel room. He even tried to kidnap his ex-wife at knife point.
That's a scary pattern of violence, especially against women. It makes you wonder, if they'd known all that back in 1990, could things have gone differently?
Yeah, it's a question that everyone involved in the case has probably thought about. So with this new information, Detective Lamont and his team went to see Brandner at his place in Kenosha, Wisconsin. At first, Brandner said he had nothing to do with Barrett's case, said he didn't even know her. But when they showed him her picture, he totally changed. Got really nervous, started stuttering, couldn't even look at them.
You know, sometimes those nonverbal reactions speak louder than words. It can be a sign of guilt or fear of getting caught.
Exactly. They brought Brandner in for questioning, but he kept denying everything. But when they confronted him about the fingerprints, his prints were all over the inside of Barrett's van. He couldn't explain it.
I mean, those fingerprints put him right there at the scene. It seems like that would be pretty hard to argue against.
You'd think so, but he just kept denying it. But once they named Brandner as the main suspect, more information started coming out. Someone who used to work with Brandner said he kept Barrett's picture in his toolbox. And another coworker remembered Brandner talking about fantasies of kidnapping and assaulting her.
So now it's not just about him being there, but maybe having a reason and planning it out. Keeping her picture and talking about those things. It sounds like an obsession.
And remember those cigarette ashes they found in Barrett's van? Turns out Brandner was a smoker.
All those little details start to add up to something much bigger. Do you think that's what finally pushed the prosecution to press charges?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. The fingerprints, the witnesses, and all the evidence pointing to him. So in March 2015, almost 25 years after Barrett was murdered, Brandner was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. For Barrett's family, it was a long time coming. A chance to finally get justice for their daughter.
It must have been bittersweet, though. The pain of losing Barrett doesn't just go away. But at least they were closer to some kind of resolution. What were some of the challenges the prosecution faced trying to bring a case like this to trial after so many years?
Oh man, trying a case that was almost 25 years old was really tough. They had the fingerprints, Brandner's past, and what the witnesses said. But they didn't have the kind of evidence that juries expect nowadays, like DNA or video footage, and that's when things took a pretty big turn.
It makes you think about how you build a case when you're dealing with old evidence and legal limits. That must have been a huge obstacle for them.
It was. Brantner's first trial actually ended in a mistrial. Even though the jury thought he killed Barrett, they couldn't agree on whether they had enough proof that he planned to murder her. This really messed things up and forced the prosecution to rethink their whole strategy for the second trial, especially because of the statute of limitations.
Ah, right, the statute of limitations. That could be a really controversial topic, especially in cases like this. Can you explain how that played into this case?
Well, imagine if after all this time and effort, Brantner could just walk free because too much time had passed. I mean, can you imagine the outrage if the jury convicted him on a lesser charge like second-degree reckless homicide? He might have been able to avoid any more punishment because of the statute of limitations. It was a loophole they couldn't ignore.
That must have put a lot of pressure on the prosecution. They wanted to hold Brander accountable, but also make sure he didn't get off on a technicality. So what did they do?
They had a tough decision to make. They wanted Brantner to face consequences, but they didn't want to risk him getting off because of some legal technicality. So in the end, they offered him a plea deal.
Plea deals can be controversial, but they're pretty common. It's a way to reach a resolution without all the uncertainty of a trial. What were the terms of this plea deal?
Brantner agreed to plead guilty to second-degree reckless homicide, and he gave up his right to fight the statute of limitations. In exchange, he got a 10-year prison sentence. But he entered what's called an Alford plea, which means he's saying he's innocent, but he admits that the state probably had enough evidence to convict him.
So basically, he took the deal to avoid a possibly longer sentence, but he still insists he didn't do it. That must have been hard for Barrett's family to accept.
It was a controversial outcome. Some people thought 10 years wasn't enough for taking a young woman's life. Others felt like it was the best they could get given how complicated the case was, and the fact that Brantner might have walked free.
It shows the tough choices prosecutors face with cold cases. They want justice, but they also have to deal with the legal system and the evidence they have. How did Barrett's family react to all of this?
In the end, they supported the plea deal. They knew it wasn't perfect. But after 28 years of not knowing, they were finally getting some closure. They got to see the man who was responsible for their daughter's death held accountable, even if the sentence didn't seem long enough to some people.
It shows how strong they are. They went through years of uncertainty and pain, but never gave up on getting justice. Their story reminds us that even with tragedy and complicated legal stuff, there's always a chance for peace. It's interesting that this case started a bigger conversation about sentencing laws and the statute of limitations, especially for violent crimes.
It's a debate that's still going on today. But beyond the legal stuff, this case also shows how much forensic science has advanced and how important it is to have people who refuse to let these cold cases stay unsolved. It really got people talking about how we punish violent crimes. And this whole idea of statutes of limitations, it bothers a lot of people that someone could basically get away with something terrible just because a lot of time has passed.
Yeah, I get that. The pain of losing someone to violence doesn't just disappear over time. So the idea that justice should be served no matter how long it's been, that's a really powerful argument.
Barrett's mom, Diane, has been really vocal about this. She thinks murder should always be treated as murder, no matter how much time has gone by. It makes you think, should the law be more flexible in these cases?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. No easy answers there. But one thing's for sure, forensic science was crucial in this case. If they hadn't gotten that hit on the fingerprint database, Brantner might never have been linked to Barrett's murder. It just goes to show you how cold cases can be solved even after decades, all thanks to technology.
And we can't forget about the people involved. Detective Lamont, he was really dedicated to this case. He was determined to get some answers for Barrett's family, and he never gave up.
He sounds like a remarkable detective. I mean, you can really feel his empathy. He understood how much this crime affected not just Barrett's family, but the whole community.
He even met with Barrett's family after the mistrial, to explain what happened and let them know he wasn't giving up. It reminds you that behind all the evidence and legal stuff, there are real people dealing with a horrible loss, and they're just looking for answers.
That says a lot about his character and his commitment to getting justice. It's that human connection that can really make a difference in situations like this.
And in the middle of all this tragedy, there's something good that came out of it. Barrett's family started a music scholarship in her name at her high school. She was a really talented violinist, and this scholarship helps keep her love of music alive.
That's a beautiful way to honor her, to turn their grief into something positive, to make sure her spirit and her love for music live on.
So what does all this mean for you listening? This case brings up some really important questions about our legal system, about the power of forensic science, about how strong the human spirit can be. It makes us think about what justice really means and how we find closure when we've experienced a loss like this.
It also makes you think about the role of technology in solving crimes and the ethical questions that come with that. How do we find a balance between seeking justice and protecting the rights of the accused, even decades after a crime has happened? These are questions we'll have to keep wrestling with as a society.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, but there's always more to explore. You might be wondering about the debate surrounding statutes of limitations, especially in cases involving violent crimes. It's a complex issue with strong arguments on both sides. Maybe this case makes you want to learn more about that debate and think about what it means for our justice system.
And as forensic science keeps advancing, what new ways will we find to solve cold cases? Will more families find some peace, or will we face even tougher ethical challenges? These are questions worth thinking about.
The murder of Barrett Beck is a story that sticks with you. It reminds us that the road to justice can be long and complicated, but we should never give up on the search for truth and accountability. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.